Hi guys. So now today we are going to understand how we can divide components. Why do we need to divide components is because sometimes our component code becomes very big. Now this is a simple component which we already did in our previous classes, which was hobby component, where we can add a hobby and uh, I think it's simple. We are just able to add a hobby and show the added hobbies. So although this is a small component, but there are times when our component becomes very big. And I've seen, in some components, the code may even go up to 500 lines or even 1,000 lines. So in such situations, it is recommended that we, divide our components into small components. So we will do a small exercise today with this hobby component and see what we can do. So now let's look at the HTML of the hobby component, where we are able to add a hobby, and then we are able to show hobbies. Correct? So how we will do the division is that we will now divide it into multiple components. First component that I'm going to divide is going to be my hobby form, which contains all the form elements. Second is going to be my hobby container that shows me all the hobbies. So let me just show these things in different colors. So the next is going to be my hobby container, which shows all the hobbies. And inside that we will have one more component, which is going to be my single hobby component. We will understand it, but let me first show you what we intend to do. So let's now just write it down what each component will be. So first will be my component, which will be hobby form. So the name is going to be hobby form. That's what the name of this component will be. Next name of the component is going to be hobby container, because it contains all the, or maybe we can give it a name. Hobby container may not be the very, a very good name. I can give it as, because I'm showing a lot of hobbies here. So we will give it a name as hobbies. And another component inside that is this component. We will give this component a name as single hobby, because it will only show one hobby. So this is going to be single hobby. So these are my three components. So what I will do is I will start separating my code into components now. And let's get started. So first thing, let's now copy this piece of code, which is the hobby form, and create a new component just down below. Function. Hobby form. That's what the name of the component is going to be. Hobby form. And inside that, I'm just going to return the HTML of the form. Now we will need to enclose these inside a div, because we need one root element. Save it. And this becomes my hobby component, hobby form component. However, this component needs some functions, like, this component needs, a single hobby variable, and a change hobby function, and a add hobby function. So it's also important that whenever we divide our component, we have to realize what are the things we need to transfer from our parent component to the child component. So we can see we need these three values here, right? Which is important now. So we need first single hobby variable, we need change hobby, and we need add hobby function. These three values are needed. So what we will do, we will pass these values to our component as a prop. We already know what is a prop. So this is where we are going to pass these values. So let me write this piece of code here. In the top, where I was showing my hobby form, instead of that, I'm going to hobby, where I was showing all the HTMLs, I'm going to write down hobby form. And I will pass first single hobby value. Next, I will pass change hobby function. We know we can also pass functions. And next thing we will pass is add hobby function. So all these values we are now passing. I can also just write it like this so that we are understanding each value being passed. All right, good. So what is the next thing now? Well, the next thing is we need to pass these values as a prop. So let me come back here to my function and destructure my props with single hobby, comma, change hobby, comma, add hobby. Save my code, and let me now go back to the app.js, and I'll remove the old code, what I've written. Let me just now show the hobby component. Save it, and let us see if we are able to get down. Yes, and let me try to add one hobby to verify whether it is working or not. And yes, wonderful, it is working. Fantastic. So see, it's very simple. We have been able to now create a separate component. Now we need to do the same thing for our this hobbies component. So again, I'm going to create one more component called hobbies. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to now cut this piece of code and paste it here. So the next thing what I would do is I would like to understand, does this component need anything? And yes, it needs what? It needs hobby variable. So we will come back here. We'll write hobbies component. And to this, we are going to pass hobby value. Now we have passed it as a prop, so we will just destructure it here, hobby value. Save it, and now let us see if I'm able to also make my component work. And I think there is some error. Let us see what is the error. Oh yes, I get the error. So the error is now that we need to again enclose this in a component. Sorry, in a div root element. And if we want to preserve the structure of our application, we can just put it inside a React fragment. We already know what is a React fragment, correct? So that way we are not adding an extra div to our component. Save it and let us see if our component is working now. Let me add one more running as a hobby maybe, and it is working fine. So simple it is. Now I have made my component smaller. Now there is one more thing. This component can further be made small. Now this component hobbies shows all the hobbies. I can create one more component called hobby, which will show one hobby. So we will give it a name single hobby, right? Okay, so single hobby is a variable also. Maybe, okay, we can give it a name. Single hobby. No, this might create problem because we are having a function with the name single hobby. So let's give it a name as maybe, you know, so the name we can give it as single hobby component, just this name, and it will represent one hobby. So now we will copy this piece of code which is displaying one hobby, or we'll just cut it, and here we will return and we will display it. One more thing we need to do now is to find out, does this component need anything? And yes, it needs value variable. So we will again come here, and instead of this return, I'm going to write single hobby component, single hobby component, and pass it the value variable. So whatever values we need to pass, we can just mention them here and pass as props. And again, we need to destructure the value here, passing it as a prop to the function. Save it. And now again, let us see if my component is working. Again, value not defined. Why value not defined? Let's find out. Okay, let me save it. And let's write maybe gym as a hobby, and it is working fine. So you see now we have been able to divide our, our big component, which was hobby, into smaller components, which is HobbyForm, passing whatever the value it needs, hobbies, and inside hobbies, again, we are able to divide it further by single hobby component, which represents one hobby. So this is how we can do our component division. Now, one last thing remains, guys. We have divided our components, but we cannot keep all the components in one file. It's not a good practice. So I'm going to now remove them and keep in separate files. Starting with HobbyForm, I will now create a new file, give it a name, HobbyForm. And inside this, I will paste my component and do an export default of HobbyForm. Now, once I have done that, this HobbyForm is not available to this file. So we will again go to the top and import the HobbyForm from the file, which is HobbyForm. Simple, guys. Now we will repeat the same step for the remaining component. But before that, let us see if our code is working fine, and I see it is working fine. So let's do the same thing with our hobbies component. Cut it, create a new file, give it a name hobbies.js. Just one thing we have to remember in this situation is that the hobbies component needs a single hobby component, right? So we will now create one more separate file, give it a name called single hobby component comp.js. Very nice. Do the export default here also. And now within my hobbies component, I need to import single hobby component from the file single hobby component. So my single hobby component.js has to be renamed because the OIC has become capital. So I'll just see if it is, I think it is not capital, it's fine. So now if everything is fine, let us see if my application is working or not. Again, let's add one more hobby as hiking, and it is working fine. So simple. So what I've done, let me quickly show you. This is my hobby component which is, yeah, this is my hobby component. And I have divided it into 3 components. First is the hobby form. Second is the hobbies component. And the hobbies component is further divided into, here one more component, which is single hobby component, which I am showing here. So that way, guys, we can divide our components. You can do the same exercise for todo.js also. All right. And see if you are able to get it working. Because in the coming time, we are going to, divide our components a lot. So make sure you also get it right. So that is all, guys, for now. And you also give this exercise a try and see if you are able to get it working. Next, we will get back with the next level of discussion on React.